All right, we're going to look here at the 2019 macro question number 2. So this is a short FRQ. Let's pull it up here. All right, so 2019 macro question number 2. So we're on one of these shorter FRQs, so it shouldn't be too bad here. So let's take a look. Assume the expected inflation rate in a country is 3%, the current unemployment rate is 6%, and the natural rate of unemployment is 4%. All right, so we're given all these sort of data points about this country here. So let's go to part A. Part A says draw a correctly labeled graph of the short run and long run Phillips curves. Label the current short run equilibrium as point X and plot the numerical values above on the graph. All right, so we're going to draw here a graph here of the Phillips curves, both short run and long run, and we're going to use all these sort of points on this graph. And it's good here, they give you all this stuff that you're supposed to have on here, right? So let's see, I need to annotate. Okay, so let's go, maybe a little bit more space over here. Let's draw it over here. All right, Phillips curve. This graph, if you remember, examines sort of the correlation between inflation and unemployment. Remember, it is a little bit of a fuzzy concept, but here we are in the realm of theoretical economics, right? There's no room for that on the AP exam. So what we're going to do, we have inflation up here, the y-axis, down here on this axis, x-axis, we have unemployment. So these are both percentages, right? Inflation is a percent change. Unemployment is also a percent, right? A percentage of unemployed. Okay, so let's start with the Phillips curves, right? So short run Phillips curves, you remember the relationship, there's a trade-off, right, between these two variables in the short run. So you should have something of a downward sloping curve here. So we're looking, you know, as the unemployment rate increases, right, we would expect inflation to decrease, and flip that the other way, right? If we're decreasing unemployment, we'd be moving up the curve, right? And we would expect the inflation rate to be increasing. So, and we're going to label this curve, make sure we're able to do that. SRPC is fine, right? Short run Phillips curve. And then now we got to, before we put our data points in there, let's do the long run Phillips curve. So the key thing is that this trade-off between inflation and unemployment is sort of a short run phenomenon, right? In the long run, this breaks down, there is no relationship, right? So in the long run, the unemployment rate, if you remember back to our ADAS models, the economy wants to gravitate towards full employment, right? So at full employment, that's you know, where our real GDP is at the natural rate of unemployment. So in the long run, our Phillips curve is going to be vertical. So let's label it LRPC, right? Long run Phillips curve. And let's just, from a theoretical perspective, let's label that point the natural rate of unemployment, right? So what this is saying is that in the long run, the economy is going to gravitate towards a natural rate of unemployment, regardless of whatever the inflation rate is, right? So there's no trade-off in the long run. The NRU is essentially what it is, right? It can change, but it's pretty much set here. And in fact, in this question, this specific question, they give us this point, right? Let's go up here, natural rate of unemployment, 4%. So now we can start filling in, oops. So that point, right, should be 4%, because we know that's what the NRU is, and that's where we know the long run Phillips curve should intersect there. Okay, so what else do we need to label here? We need to find, so here's the key, right? Expected inflation rate is 3%. So what does that mean? Well, where are we going to put this on the graph? The expected inflation rate is what we would expect the inflation rate to be if we're at sort of long-run equilibrium, right? And if we're at long-run equilibrium, that means we're at this 4% on RU, right? So you can essentially come across here, this intersection, over to the inflation rate, and then we can label that as 3%. So that's sort of the expected inflation rate if we're in equilibrium. So you find your NRU where that intersects the SRPC, short-run Phillips curve, and then you come across and label that in, right? And then the last one, we need to label and make sure they do what they want. They want it to label point X. And but they give us a different value, right? They say the current unemployment rate is actually 6%. So that should jump out to you, right? 6%, which is what? Above the natural rate of unemployment. So what we do on the graph, right? Come over here, find a point over here. So we can draw a thing, right? So we know the actual unemployment rate is 6%. Okay, and then they don't give us an actual value, but if you wanted to, you could draw this over here, and you could pretty clearly see, because that's where we're going here in part B. But let's make sure also, so I didn't actually do this, point X, right? So that's our current equilibrium right there. So let's go to part B now. Is the actual inflation rate greater than, less than, or equal to the expected inflation rate of 3%? Now, this is one of those questions on an FRQ where, you know, a graph, in a way, a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? Because you draw this graph correctly, especially if you pull this point over here, it's pretty clear that the inflation rate is less than, right? This is what we expected, 3%. But because our our unemployment rate is higher than what we would expect at equilibrium, our inflation rate is going to be somewhere down below. We don't know the exact number, but it's clear on the graph because this is downward sloping short-run Phillips curve that it'll be less than, right? So, and again, as long as you have the graph drawn correctly, a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? You don't have to really explain yourself here. You just say, well, it's clear on the picture and the graph. The actual inflation rate is going to be less than what we expected right there. So that's essentially all you need for part B. All right, so let's go to part C. Assume loans were made taking into account the expected inflation rate of 3%. Will lenders be better off or worse off after they realize the actual inflation rate identified in part B? And then explain, right? So this is really asking about who's going to benefit, right? So we had an expected inflation rate of 3%, and something changed, right? Obviously, we see we're not getting an actual inflation rate of 3%. In fact, in part B, we said, well, it's actually going to be less than, right? Now, if you want to think about it, it could be 2%, 1%, whatever. If you want to pick an actual number, just to think about it intuitively, you can. And then the question is asking, who's going to benefit from that, right? Is it going to be lenders or is it going to be borrowers, right? And they ask specifically about lenders. Are they be better off or worse off? But that's the essential question, right? When something changes regarding inflation from what we expected, are lenders going to be better off or are borrowers going to be better off? So let's just pick an example. Let's just say this point over here is 1%, right? We expected 3% inflation. But the actual inflation rate turned out to be 1%. Now, is that good for lenders or is it bad for lenders? Well, so think about it, right? If you remember back to the banking material, right? So what is our real return? So how do we calculate real return, right? You take the nominal interest rate and you subtract the inflation rate. So let's think about this. So if I'm a bank, right? So I'm a lender, right? That's what this question is asking about. Are the lenders going to be better off or worse off? So when I'm making a loan, to figure out what I'm going to charge for my nominal interest rate, right, I have to add in, I have to take my real return and I got to add my inflation. Or actually, in that case, my expected inflation, right? Because when I'm making the loan, let's say it's a 2, 3, 5-year loan, I don't know what the actual rate of inflation is going to be, right? So I'm going to take my best guess, my best estimate, my expectations of inflation, and then I'm going to put that into my loan, right? So I'm going to, let's just say I want a 5% rate of return, a real rate of return on my loan. I have to take, well, I expect inflation to be 3% when I'm giving this loan out. So I'm actually going to add that back to my 5% real return, right? So the nominal interest rate that I'm actually going to charge this person that I'm lending money to is going to be 8%. Now I expect the inflation rate to be 3%. So my real return then would be actually 5%, right? And that's what I wanted at the beginning. Now, expectations and reality don't always necessarily match up. So in this particular example, so I set my nominal interest rate to 8%, right? You know, I was expecting 3%, so I was going to get a 5% return. Well, what happened? Well, the reality didn't match up to my expectations, right? Inflation came in less than what I expected. So if I'm going to figure out my real return, right now it's 8. I still charge nominal interest rates, right? Because that was what I gave out, or that's what I charged at the beginning when I lent out the money. And now I got to subtract the inflation rate, 1%. So look, my real return is actually 7%. Okay, so instead of 5% was what I wanted, I actually got 7%. So going back to the question here, let's see, who will lenders be better off or worse off? Well, I'm going to be better off, right? Now you need to sort of explain this in a way. If you want to, you know, sketch out an equation here and write a sentence or two about it, you can do that. But really, you just have to essentially say that the you know, the real value of the money being paid back is going to be greater, right? Because inflation came in less than what we had expected. You know, if it was asking the flip side, you know, what happens to borrowers in this case, the borrowers are going to be worse off, right? Because the actual inflation was less than what they expected, and they had paid up for it, right? Through this equation, right? Through the inflation expectations. It's a good lesson in, you know, how expectations, everybody always has, it's all built in there, but the reality doesn't always necessarily, in fact, it frequently doesn't match up perfectly with the expectations. And you know, the bigger the change, the bigger the surprise in either direction, the bigger the sort of consequences for the people involved in these transactions. All right, so let's go to part D now. So based upon the relationship between the actual and expected inflation rates identified in part A, what will happen to the natural rate of unemployment in the long run? So this question, nothing. All right, so the NRU in this case will remain in the long run at, what did we say, 4%. So the answer to this is no change, right? No change. So that's not to say that the NRU could not ever change a foreign economy. In fact, it certainly could if certain major factors. But in this specific question, they're asking about, you know, inflation, actual and expected inflation, what impact that variable has upon the natural rate of unemployment. And the answer to that is none, right? No relationship. And in fact, that's why the long run Phillips curve is vertical. It's showing you that there's no relationship in the long run between the NRU and the inflation rate, right? You could have very high inflation way up here on the curve, or you could have very relatively low inflation down here. In either case, the NRU in the long run is still 4%. So no change for part D.